We're coming up to the end of 2024, and here are the JRPGs I have played during that period. Now, the first game I played was the original Dragon Quest, played on Nintendo Switch, and it took me 6 hours to finish. Now, this was actually finished back at the end of August. I said to myself that I would have a small break from games until the start of a busy final third of 2024, but I found myself in the mood for a simple yet fun palate cleanser. And what better to do that than the game that effectively started it all for JRPGs back in 1986. That's crazy to me. This game came out 6 years before I was even born. And it did just that. Dragon Quest was exactly what I needed after my more involved playthroughs with games like Harvestella. It was a game I could effectively lie down with while watching a stream or listening to a podcast. It's charmingly simplistic and hands-off in pretty much every regard. For that reason, the commentary on this will be brief because there's not much to say about the original Dragon Quest. The story is that you are the descendant of the legendary hero Erdrick, and you are tasked with finding the Sphere of Light, thus saving the world from the Dragon Lord. That's it. Go out in the world and save the kingdom. Dragon Quest is understandably lacking in much direction. Most of the points of interest are given to you by NPCs. You get a world to explore and you just gotta go out there and find the means by which you can defeat your fated foe. Battles are a turn-based affair and you only control the hero himself. The hero has a standard attack, item usage, and of course a host of iconic spells like Sizz, Zoom and Fizzle that he learns as he levels up. There's a lot of grinding, no doubt, but what I really did enjoy about this game is that there was a surprising amount of optional content, even an alternate ending if you did a certain event. It does pay dividends to those who actually explore all corners of its world. It just did what it needed to do. It was a nice change of pace from the games I had played, exactly what I needed to refresh, and for £3.25, I wasn't going to pass up on the chance to see where it all began for the genre. The second game I played was Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia on 3DS. It took me 30 hours to finish. Man, I'm so happy that I still have my 3DS. I came extremely close to selling it about 3 years ago, but as I've started to build up my collection again, I've actually accumulated a fair hoard of games to try out now, one of which was Shadows of Valentia. Now, I've had this one marked in the back of my mind ever since Britta from Food for Dogs said that this was one of her favourite games of all time. Naturally, I wanted to see if our minds fought alike. And in many respects I agree. Shadows of Valentia is a gateway to the type of Fire Emblem game that we're never going to see anymore. Not from the newer ones at least. Intelligent Systems have found a formula that works for the modern entries, especially the higher focus on the social/dating sim aspect and the self-insert protag. I don't begrudge them that, you go where the money is, and without Awakening, Fire Emblem wouldn't exist today. It was at very high risk of being shelved forever until that game was made, so no doubt Intelligent Systems have done the right thing for the future longevity of the franchise. Even so, Shadows of Valentia was such a refreshing experience compared to the games I've played so far. It reminded me of those years all the way back when I first played Radiant Dawn. At its core, it's still Fire Emblem. You look at the map designs, the presentation of units, the familiarity is there, but at the same time it has many aspects within it that allow it to stand apart from modern contemporaries. And that's most likely because despite it being a modern entry in of itself, it's actually a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden, or Fire Emblem 2 in layman's terms, which released back in 1992. The remake was an attempt to combine the role-playing elements of the original while also deepening the aspects of areas like story to bring it more in line for modern audiences. What they eventually made was, in my opinion, an extremely satisfying experience. Though it has its share of annoyances, Shadows of Valentia is a joy of a game and a must-play for those who own a 3DS. The game follows the stories of Arm and Celica, two children who are separated due to a war between the strongest powers of the continent of Valentia. The war eventually forces Arm and Celica to find their own solution to end it, Arm choosing the path of battle, Celica the path of peace. Both embark on their journey across Valentia with both campaigns running simultaneously. Now, the core premise of Shadows of Valentia is already a massive win to me. The dual protag feature centered around Arm and Celica is very well presented, and I have to say, I prefer this method of storytelling if a game is to have dual protags. Unlike, say, Star Ocean 2 or Divine Force, where you have to do a full playthrough of each character, Valentia instead has the two campaigns run side by side and you can switch between them on the fly. There are certain roadblocks that force you to switch over at points, but undoubtedly this is so much better for me. In short, it respects the player's time while also giving a differing viewpoint from the perspective of each character for that exact moment of the story. It helps too that Arm and Celica are just good pro tags. Decent chemistry, I think the English voice acting is solid, which was the only option by the way since it's a 3DS game for a Western player, and their stories are well fleshed out. I have to say as well that I really like the presentation of the game, especially with the pre-rendered cutscenes. They are pretty good, even considering how old the 3DS is nowadays. But back to the pro tags, they have understandable motivations, they follow through on their convictions, and it comes together really well by the end. And this is why I will always prefer the games with set protagonists rather than the self-insert. I've got nothing against self-inserts, but I feel that it binds the hands of the writers because the natural inclination is to make a story that weaves around the protagonist in that case. I feel that Fire Emblem Engage is the poster child for that. In Shadows of Valentia, however, the story and the characters can more freely work together, and the overall journey is better off for it. It's not just Arm and Celica either, I think many of the characters are enjoyable. They have one of those modern staples of character events between members, and it gives them a bit more personality. In short, I quite liked the cast overall for both armies. Now like I said before, Shadows of Valentia aims to keep many of the aspects of Gaiden while also modernising them for current audiences. One of these aspects is the overmap feature. You choose Arm or Celica's armies and then move across the map to hubs like towns. When you visit, you go in a first person view that will look quite similar to games like Shin Megami Tensei 4 in terms of presentation. You can freely look around for items, do side quests and talk to NPCs. It's nothing major, but I like this. It brings the world to life more in my eyes. It's not all about the towns though. You of course have battles and a noteworthy feature of Shadows of Valentia, which are dungeons. This is one of the big differences Echoes has against contemporaries. Exploration of dungeons is very much like a typical dungeon crawler experience. You go through the area, fight enemies in the standard strategic format, find treasures, and fountains to raise character stats. It functions as a way to grind experience for characters if you're a bit underprepared. I'm not a massive fan of dungeon crawlers myself, but I was fine with these. They were certainly not the core of the experience, and they were spread out well enough to not be overbearing. I can't deny it was fun finding items and secrets in the depths too. Granted, some of the later dungeons tip the scale a bit too much. They're not only very long, but you also cannot save until you get to particular spots. So if you make a mistake or get unlucky and cause either Arm or Celica to die, it's game over, and you've lost a fair amount of progress. By the way, this game does have permadeath of units if you so choose, but you can switch it to casual at your leisure. This has no effect on Arm or Celica though. If either of them dies, the game ends instantly. Now I'll be real, I had to switch modes at certain points. Most of the time it was on classic, but I switched it to casual on quite a few occasions. And that's because Shadows of Valentia really skirts the line at times between enjoyable challenge and just outright annoyance. The battle system is for the most part what you'd expect from this franchise, but one big difference is that there is no weapons triangle. This makes sense, as the weapons triangle was never a thing until Fire Emblem 4. Instead, more emphasis is placed on terrain, standing among woods or gravestones to increase evasion rates. It's a nice change of pace. Granted, there are still staples like bows being strong against flying enemies and magic against armoured units, but for the most part, it plays differently. And 90% of the time it's really fun, as you'd expect. You've got different classes to work with, a good deal of individuality between party members in terms of skills they can use, and a really cool mechanic is in the weapons themselves. In this game you simply equip a weapon, and the character not only gains its stats, but can learn new skills from it. Unfortunately, you cannot use skills associated with that weapon when you unequip it, but it gives you incentive to find out all the different skill sets you can use. So there is a lot I like about Shadows of Valentia's combat, and it is overall a net positive for me. One issue I have though comes in the accuracy of attacks. It genuinely never felt like the percentage of success mattered. It could be 90% or 40%, but the amount of times I missed and the enemy hit when the probabilities were in my favour were nauseating. Like, this wasn't uncommon. It happened on so many occasions, and at times it completely screwed me. Thankfully, there is a method to reverse time which is limited per battle, but like I said before, if you get bad luck with Arm or Celica, you don't get that luxury. No joke, in one of the later dungeons, I got right to the end, took me about an hour to get there by the way, and an enemy 4% crit chanced Celica, causing her to die immediately, and I had to redo the dungeon all over again. In short, the game was frustrating at times, and it's not just the battles, some of the maps are arse, in terms of design and the enemies that inhabit it. Celicas in particular later on are just nightmare fuel. Poison swamps, narrow corridors, map-wide damage abilities, and units that spawn additional enemies that bring your progress to a halt. I was not a fan of some of these maps, and I have to say there were times when I just closed the 3DS and stepped away for the day because it grated on my nerves that much. But I would always come back, and that's because even with those issues I still really enjoyed this game. Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia from novelty alone is just a joy of a title. It has rough edges, sure, and I hated it at times, but just like any relationship, you need to bicker at points to air out all those frustrations, and once that's done, you're better off for it. That's what Shadows of Valentia is to me. It nags, it annoys, it makes me tear out my hair at points, but deep down, I still love it. It's a fantastic game. The third game I played was Final Fantasy IX as part of the Retro series. It took me 38 hours to finish. A full video was done on this, so I'll link that to you if you want my full thoughts, but in short, really good time with it. Final Fantasy IX is a game that I should have played a long time ago, but thanks to the Retro series I'm finally getting the chance to play these classics at a decent rate. Story, characters, the world itself especially, reverting back to that more high fantasy moniker. There was just so much to love about Final Fantasy IX. I was really in tune with the turn-based gameplay as well. It was a great move to have the passive and active skills that you learn over time through equipment. It really lended to the game enriching at a good pace as the hours passed by. Not all perfect, I do think there are some character arcs that aren't expanded as much as I would have liked, and I have nightmares of Chocobo Hot and Cold, but the majority of the game has held up extremely well worth the playthrough. The fourth game I played was Furyu's latest release in Rain Artist, played on PC, and it took me 10 hours before I ended up abandoning it. Full video done on this, link in the description and pinned comment if you want to see. Rain Artist pretty much confirms it to me. I just do not get on with games that Furyu are involved in, whether they be publishing or developing. Me and them are just a match made in fiery hell. The gameplay loops they come up with just feel so shallow to me, and it's the same issue of Rain Artist. Chapter to chapter you're just doing the same thing through the same old drab environments. Combat is pretty good for like 5 hours and then it quickly wears thin. The mechanics like hiding your powers become tedious, the camera is terrible, and the models look ugly. I like the look of Shibuya, they did a good job there granted. But again, back to the negatives, the music is underwhelming, the story is presented poorly, there's just very little to like with Rain Artist. 10 hours felt like double that, so I regret nothing in abandoning it and moving on. The fifth game I played was a remake of a mobile title called Witchspring R, played on PC, and it took me 22 hours to finish. Unironically, a 9 out of 10 experience for me. Wow. Genuinely wow. It might have been the fact that I played this alongside Rain Artist which allowed Witchspring R to stand out more. But what a great little game. For 30 quid, this is stellar value for money, a true hidden gem of an RPG. Now Witchspring R, like I said, is a remake of the first Witchspring game, which was a mobile title back in 2015. There are also 3 other games in the series that remain on mobile platforms. Now mobile games don't resonate with me, but this remake has turned that first experience into a satisfying traditional RPG experience. Kudos to the developers KiwiWalks for what they did here. Like, I don't even know where to start, there are so many positives to talk about, but let's give it a whirl. Witchspring R is based on the continent of Vavelia, where an event called the Spring War saw gods betrayed by humanity. These humans would go on to create their own civilizations and religions, with the offspring of the gods marked as demons to be killed upon discovery. Those who survived were abandoned in forests, which is where we find the game's protagonist, Pieberry. Pieberry, which is a combination of her favourite foods, pie and strawberries, fights against soldiers who enter the forest who have no other goal than to eliminate her and her kind. Now despite how tame the game begins, it actually has a gripping story. From the visuals alone I expected something more carefree and whimsical, but this is really good. Really good. Meaningful developments, excellent character focused stories, and it's led by a lovable protagonist. Pieberry is just such a joy to watch. She's been secluded for so long that she gains satisfaction in the simplest of things, like finding more delicious pie for herself. But even though the story starts pretty slowly, it soon balloons into something memorable. I was taken aback with how good it ended up being. Now I will note there is no English dub here, only Japanese and Korean, as this is a Korean developer, but the voiceovers were great for me. The grammar on the other hand, that was a bit shaky here and there, with some odd graphical glitches and spelling errors, but nothing egregious. And the OST, it's a bit underwhelming, with the limited songs looping far too quickly for my tastes. But it was good enough in its overall presentation. And talking about presentation, the game just looks really nice. It's a technically unimpressive graphical approach, but it just works for Witchspring R. It never needed to go to that, say, Unreal Engine 5 territory to get its style across. I will admit that some zones are a bit too bright for me, with no option to reduce the glare, which becomes a real problem when targeting enemies, but the majority of the time, pleasing to look at. But the real highlight of Witchspring R, in addition to its story might I add, is the gameplay itself. Atelier fans in particular will like this game. It's a mix of crafting, creature collecting, turn-based combat, and life sim mechanics, all centered around a core JRPG experience. You take control of Pyberry and make your way around a surprisingly vast world. Enemies will show up on the map with an area of aggression circled around them. And when Pyberry hits this, the player can see the enemy's stats and choose whether to fight, use an item to buff beforehand, or run away. Battles, as said before, are turn-based. You get control of Pyberry, but she can also call upon allies like other characters or even pets. These pets have their own skills and strengths like debuffing enemies, restoring Pyberry's mana, and though you don't get a choice of what skill they use, you can choose what target the ally attacks if there are multiple enemies. And you will be aware of what skill will be used because when the ally is due to use their more powerful ability, their icon will start glowing. Turn order is displayed on the bottom right of the screen and can indeed be manipulated with the spells that Pyberry uses. As a witch, she has a vast array of spells she can use like fire, lightning or ice. She can also use her weapon to bring the beat down close and personal. But there's added flair to this too, because as the battle progresses you get bonuses to your turns like the potential to get one more action, added elemental damage, or the ability to use a variety of blessings that Pyberry finds more of as the game goes on. Pyberry also has the option of mind controlling unique beasts in the world that she can add to her pet arsenal. In short, the core foundation of the turn-based combat is excellent and it only enriches more as the hours pass. In fact, progression is one of the game's biggest highlights. Periodically, Pyberry can train back at her home to raise her own stats. These activities normally result in a basic minigame that, while nothing special mechanically, are a nice change of pace and they're all different too. If you manage to do well on them, you also get bonus permanent stat boosts, so it pays to be good at all of them, and the game offers training modes for each if you feel the need to practice. You'll also find a host of stat boosting items in the world, and there's no doubt that the more you explore, the better the experience will be. And exploration for me is without question the best part about Witchspring R. For a game that just about clocks in at 22 hours, it is chock full of excellent optional content. Whether it be new pets to find, legendary weapons tied to side quests, new super bosses that yield specific materials for crafting the higher end spells, or just the character focused side stories which are absolutely wonderful. These character side stories for instance aren't marked on the map by the way, you have to find them yourself, but they're just very well handled and give some added meat to each of the cast, not to mention exclusive rewards that you won't find anywhere else. Some of these side quests will even affect the final chapter of the game, so it pays to do as many as you can, though the ending will remain the same. Even finding pets is engaging. For instance, you may find a statue in a cave, and the only way to awaken it is by equipping a certain item that you have to make, and then coming back to try and capture it for your own. And you'll want as many pets as you can get, because it's not just in combat that these pets become useful, they double as a method to traverse the world too in some cases, whether that be running fast across the plains, swimming through the ocean to get to inaccessible locales. You finish one task and it just opens up 2 or 3 more, but it never feels like busy work. There's just something that feels right about the progression in Witchspring R, like you're always finding something fresh that will make your journey more enjoyable. And we're not even done that, there's still crafting to talk about. So back at home base, Pyberry has a collection of recipes she can make. These range from healing items to stat boosts to completely new spells. It's easy enough to grasp, the game tells you what materials you need and where to find them, and you simply make it when you have all the prerequisites. But the spells in particular are so cool because you get certain levels of them early on, but then if you choose to explore, you can just break the game by getting higher level spells that you really shouldn't have at that point of the game. And it helps that they all have unique effects and animations too. You feel the sense you're getting stronger with every new spell you make. You've then got stuff like runes that add buffs to those spells. You can upgrade a host of weapons if you have the right materials. It's so enjoyable to get involved in it. It's astounding how much the game has to offer, and it does everything at least decently. And despite having a notable amount to do, Witchspring R nails its overall feel in terms of atmosphere. It's chill, relaxing, and in some cases therapeutic. Not once did I feel stressed playing this game, no frustration, no annoyance, just pure fun from start to finish. I cannot recommend it enough. This is a true hidden gem for a JRPG fan, a wonderfully, expertly crafted adventure that doesn't overstay its welcome and has a great narrative with equally great characters complementing it. If Kiwi Walk see it fit to remake their other games in the Witchspring series to the same level of quality as this, I'll buy them immediately, without any hesitation. Fantastic game, 9 out of 10 experience, and well worth the price of admission. The 6th game I played was Ys 10 Nordics, played on PC and it took me 34 hours to finish. My game of the year without question. I love the Ys series, it is by far and away my favourite action focused franchise, and Ys 10 Nordics just reaffirms to me why I love it so much. A full video was done on this already, so that will be linked for you to check out if you want. In short though, Ys 10 had everything I wanted in this newest iteration of the series, it just clicked. I loved the combat and the use of the new duo mode, the exploration felt top tier, music was great as always, Kaja is a brilliant addition as a dual protag, and it's just so true to its core identity. It's an Ys game through and through, and that's all I need from this series. That magic will never be lost as long as Falcom continue to make games like Ys 10, I hope it continues well into the future. The 7th game I played was one of the big hitters in Metaphor ReFantasio, played on PC and it took me 74 hours to finish. Just like Ys 10, I did a full video on this, so my commentary here is going to be brief. What a game though. What a game. Studio Zero just scored a 35-yard screamer with this one. It is a superb game. And the sales reflect that. It sold 1 million within a day. Persona 3 Reload in comparison took a week to do the same thing, I believe. People were eating this game up. It was for a very good reason. Out of the 3 games that Atlus developed this year, Metaphor ReFantasio was my favourite. No doubt SMT5 Vengeance and Persona 3 Reload were top tier releases in of themselves, but Metaphor was the one that stood at the peak for me. Similarities to Persona, sure, but a game that stood out in its own way too. The press turn combat is brilliant as always, the archetypes are awesome, the story was brilliant, the world was rich and fleshed out, and the characters were a joy from start to finish. The game is a triumph for Atlus and quite easily could become that long sought after third pillar for the developer if it becomes a franchise of its own. The 8th game I played was Fuga, Melodies of Steel, played on PC and it took me 16 hours to finish. The premise of this game is easy to grasp. A group of children are dragged into a war following an attack by the Burman Empire on their village. No rewards for figuring out who the Empire is meant to represent or what war it harkens back to. In a bid to fight back, the children find a colossal tank in a cave and the game proceeds in a linear fashion as the children push back the Burman offensive. Now here's the rundown with Fuga Melodies of Steel in terms of its commercial performance. CyberConnect 2 stated a couple of years ago that Fuga Melodies of Steel failed to cover its development costs. And though it has sold more since that point, in the grand scheme of things it didn't do too well in terms of sales. Despite that, CyberConnect 2 also stated that Fuga was a passion project for the developer, and despite it not meeting the envisioned returns, they pushed on to create a second game, and have already made it known that the third and final title is in the works too. So while higher sales would be welcome, it isn't the sole motivation for Fuga Melodies of Steel. It is a series that was birthed more out of passion than a base desire to make money. And after playing it, I can certainly see that passion on display. Fuga Melodies of Steel is such a great game. It shows that a JRPG doesn't need to reinvent the wheel to be memorable or satisfying. Fuga pretty much nails all of its fundamentals of what makes a great JRPG, and then excels in certain areas like its gameplay to remain enticing over the course of its surprisingly short runtime. The gameplay loop is as straightforward as it gets. The group of anthropomorphic children spend the entirety of the game inside the colossal tank called the Tantalus. Levels proceed in a sort of auto-scrolling fashion, the map is laid out on the top and the player at certain points will choose what path to take. Even this approach though becomes a positive feather in the cap of Fuga, as it effectively means that the difficulty of the game is flexible and moulds around the choice of the player at any given time. When at a juncture, the player gets a choice of going down the safe route, the normal route, or in some cases, the dangerous route. The more difficult the route, the better the rewards in terms of resources and experience. But it also ensures that despite being on rails, the player is constantly thinking ahead, looking at what nodes to follow in order to eventually reach the end unscathed. For instance, you want to ensure your health and skill points are at a high enough level for any challenge, so if you find yourself low, go down a safe or normal route which has some nodes dedicated to recovery. If you find yourself high on resources though, go down the dangerous route and gain more experience. This straightforward approach ultimately becomes the philosophy of Fuga Melodies of Steel. The game feels no need to bring in overly complex mechanics. Instead, it keeps things simple. It still ensures that there is depth and player freedom that makes up its gameplay, evidenced in areas like the combat. Eventually, you are going to bump into units of the Burman Empire, and the Tantalus fights against them in a turn-based format. Turn order is displayed on the top of the screen, and the idea is to push enemies back on the timeline by targeting their weaknesses. The Tantalus can use 3 separate weapon types: machine guns, grenade launchers and cannons, and each one corresponds to a certain colour. The enemies will display colour counters above their health bars, and if you hit all of them, you delay their turn. Each member of the Tantalus uses one of these weapons, and the depth of the system comes in switching them around frequently to find the most optimal solution to a fight. Each of the children also has their own set of active skills when in control of one of the 3 turrets, plus a supporting skill if they are in the secondary slot. There's also a combo ability for each partnership that gets stronger in line with the relationships of the crew members. In addition, the Tantalus also has a get out of jail card for boss fights if you find yourself in a pinch, which is the Soul Cannon. And while it basically ends the fight immediately, it does come at a cost, as its activation requires the sacrifice of one of the crew members. Needless to say, I did everything I could to keep the crew alive, and I did. I got the true ending for this game with relative ease because of it, but there were definitely times when I found myself in a tight spot. I think that Fuga does a great job in balancing its difficulty around the options a player has at that point of the story. At earlier stages, bosses for instance will have less mechanics, but later on you'll have to use everything you've gained through leveling the children to come out on top. It's a really good combat system and never overstays its welcome. It helps too that the progression inherent in the combat is front and centre the entire game. At certain points, the game shifts over to its other notable mode called intermissions. In these situations, you're basically given a small window to rest while also upgrading the Tantalus or building up relationships with the crew. You get a total of 20 action points to do so, and the idea is to use them as efficiently as you can. For instance, if any of the crew are injured from the previous part of the mission, you rest up immediately to get rid of it so they don't fall unconscious later on. Then, if you've got some points left over, go scrap fishing for materials or do one of the many expeditions to find unique items. Come back, upgrade the Tantalus, improve some facilities, maybe eat a meal for a buff or two, talk to characters if you have action points left over, and then move on to the next part of the mission. Again, just like the combat, Fuga excels because of balance. There are ample times when you're in the more high pressure situations, but there are also plenty of windows where you're taken away from that and can proceed at a more laid back pace. The entire game pretty much proceeds like this, and it comes together surprisingly well as a package. I do think there are some small concessions, like the UI being a bit finicky to work with. For example, in combat, I would have liked a small graphic on the side to show what enemies I am facing, so I have a better idea of who to switch to rather than having to memorize what I'm fighting. Also, the inside of the Tantalus does have some graphical glitching here and there, but there was nothing that came close to ruining my experience. Overall, at least in terms of gameplay, brilliant. CyberConnect 2 nailed that. And I can say the same with the other elements like characters, story and music. The OST, first of all, superb, right off the bat. The tunes match the ambience of every scene and really add to them in the majority. The characters are solid, with many of their deeper characteristics told through the bonding events aboard the Tantalus, but they gave enough to me in the main story whereby I felt attached to each of them come the end. Hence my desire to keep them all alive rather than using them as fuel for the Soul Cannon. And the overall story is good, certainly a bit bare bones in terms of setup and foundation, but the big impact moments hit just right, complemented by this wonderful artwork to help you visualise the scene better. What surprised me the most though is that this game is actually a prequel for a DS action RPG that came out in 2010. The more you know, right? I'll be real, the story here did enough to make me want to try and seek it out in the future too, so that's a success in my book. In short, Fuga Melodies of Steel was a game that I never expected to enjoy as much as I did. It's got a certain charm and care put into it that becomes more and more evident the longer you play. This was a game made because of passion and drive, not out of a desire to be the next big thing, something that certain other developers could learn from. This approach ensures that the intended vision of the game is unhindered. The writers and developers get to display what they wanted to show from the very beginning, and it's no wonder to me that because of its clear identity and direction, the game ended up as good as it did. The real hope I have is that when the final game comes out, CyberConnect 2 find a way to get these games together in a form of physical trilogy pack. The one real issue at its door at the moment is that it's completely digital, which I do think hindered its sales along with some pretty lackluster marketing. There's no doubt in my mind though that if the developer finds a way to get the games transferred to physical media in a bundle, they're going to sell much better, because the quality of the games, like this first one, speaks for itself. The 9th game I played was Bloomtown, a different story, played on PC, and it took me 12 hours to finish. Now, I played the demo of this a few months back. Most of my thoughts on the game remain consistent from that. Bloomtown is pretty much Persona Light. It's definitely not at the level of Atlus's Juggernaut, but it is cut from the same cloth, and manages to do enough to stand out by itself. You've got that 1950s Americana feel similar to Ni no Kuni, a bit of Harvest Moon in there, and also a bit of Earthbound. Put it all together and you get Bloomtown, which was one of my most anticipated games of 2024. After finishing it, I did have a good time. I think the combat mechanics are solid, the music is excellent, art style is captivating, and it's got a decently engaging gameplay loop all said and done, with the idea of moving around Bloomtown and doing what you want to raise your own stats while going into the dungeons to save the children. It is flawed though. The menus remain cumbersome to navigate, there's a huge amount of grammatical errors which take away from the flow of dialogue. Some of the translations are incorrect, for example, items that say they will restore HP actually restore SP instead. Characters will miss too often, which goes against the grain of a press-turn system, and bosses are immune to all status ailment, which again goes against the main draw of this combat, as bonus damage is inflicted when an enemy is afflicted with poison, burns or the like. It does feel unpolished. There's undoubtedly a great core to Bloomtown which saw me through, and it's not a long game all said and done, but I think it needed more time. The story in particular doesn't really have any depth or nuance to it, despite touching on several themes that could easily be expanded upon. Still, for its asking price and for its short runtime as well, I think you can get a good time out of this one. It's by no means perfect, but I appreciate what Lazy Bear Studios attempted to do with it. The 10th game I played was Visions of Mana, played on PC, and it took me 28 hours to finish. Man, Visions of Mana. I had fun with it. A lot of fun in many respects, but I can't help but wonder what it could have been had it realised its full potential. It is a very good game, and does many things right, but in that same breath, it is flawed in areas too, and those flaws are so clear that it threatens to engulf the positive aspects completely. Even so, Visions of Mana is one of those games where, despite knowing about its issues, I'm still content in recommending it to JRPG fans, especially those looking for a more relaxing and laid-back adventure-style game. Titles like Visions of Mana should exist. They have a place in any backlog. I think it's important in this day and age especially that we find games that keep it simple, that don't veer off into the realm of unique mechanics just for the sake of being different. This style of adventure worked 3 decades ago, and it will continue to work 3 decades later too. Visions of Mana is centered around the soul guard Val, who is tasked with escorting the chosen arms to the Tree of Mana. These arms will eventually sacrifice themselves to restore the flow of mana and keep the world safe from calamity. Val and Hina, the Arm of Fire, set out from their home to find the other arms and do just that. A by-the-numbers adventure premise if I've ever seen one. Now, as I stepped out of the village for the first time and got my initial taste of what the game was all about, I was so excited. Those first 5 hours had Visions of Mana in my top 5 games of 2024, and with some ease as well. Semi-open world zones and freedom to pretty much go wherever you want, at least within the confines of the maps. And why wouldn't you want to do that when the game looks so good? Oh my word, this is eye candy. In JRPG form, one of the most beautiful fantasy worlds I have ever seen. The art team for Visions of Mana passed their test with flying colours. I have not one bad thing to say about their work. The overall look of this game harkens back to the roots of JRPGs, back when many took on this high fantasy setting. You had a world of infinite possibility, unique locales, and that sense of sprawling adventure at every turn. Visions of Mana embraces that and excels while doing it. Every land is completely separate from the last and they all look amazing. I can't count the amount of times I just stopped to take in the vistas around me, whether it be the wide open plains of Arvet's pasture or the snowy tundras of the Lefeya Drifts. It is so well realised. And that first visit to the Mana Tree, oh my word, they nailed it. They absolutely nailed the feeling of approaching a holy sanctuary. It is one of those moments that sticks long in the memory. A lot of the highlights for Visions of Mana comes from the environment and world itself. Very well done. And though I saw quite a bit of issue with the character designs before launch, well, at least from other people, I'm happy with what they came up with here. They're nicely stylised, well animated for the most part. No, I had no issue with the designs of the characters in this game. Literally, not one bad point to be made about the art team. Fantastic work by all of them. The only real issue I had with just travelling around the world was with the PC port itself. Not optimised perfectly, it has to be said, with some graphics not showing on the map. Here, for example, there should be a save point, but there's nothing there. And sometimes fights wouldn't trigger unless I left and re-entered a zone. The cutscenes in particular running at 30 FPS is a bit off-putting when the rest of the game runs at least 60, so off-putting in fact I found a mod to get them to run better. There was the odd frame dip too, but nothing terrible, and all in all it didn't crash, so it's far from the worst port you're gonna see. Anyway, back to the good stuff. The OST. Really good for my tastes, especially the overworld themes, just running across the fields with these brilliantly fitting themes ringing in your ears. Ooh yes, that is what it's all about. And that exploration is made even better with the use of the elemental vessels. These are items that allow the party to call on the powers of the elementals in order to fight or indeed travel around the world. You'll ride air currents to higher ground, mount giant rockets. I think the crossover between the vessels and how they're used in exploration is pretty good, all said and done. But in the majority, you use the elemental vessels in battle. Combat in Visions of Mana, it's a mixed bag. It's an action RPG and I can't deny I would prefer a more slick approach to combat like Nier Automata for example, but this more weighty and deliberate approach for Visions of Mana is fine. It was clearly a design choice and you do get used to it within I'd say a couple of hours. You have your standard attacks, heavy attacks, a host of skills, and you can also use abilities linked to the elemental vessel along with a special move when the gauge is full. It's nothing you haven't seen before, but it does work well. Yet, the real draw of Visions of Mana's combat comes in the different classes. Every elemental vessel bestows its power on the person who wears it, and that means that every character gets a host of different jobs they can use, a total of 8 for each. And all those classes have a linear skill tree attached to them for passive and active improvements. And though some of the classes feel similar in certain respects, the customization potential afforded by Visions of Mana is without question to me the best part about its gameplay. You've got so many things to work with, and what I like more is that learning a skill means you have learnt it. In other words, even if you switch to another class, you still get access to that skill despite not using the class that it was sourced from. For instance, I used the Duelist class for Val pretty much all the time, which used a greatsword. This meant that any greatsword based ability I acquired from other classes would carry over to the Duelist too. Enriching my experience at every moment, it's a good design decision I feel. And I do think the combat shines in some respects. There's a fair amount of decent bosses in the game, and I think the dungeon design is pretty good. They're not offensively long outside of the final dungeon, not a fan of that. And they all play on a certain gimmick often tied to one of the elemental vessels. Not many puzzles in them either, which I do prefer. So there's no question that Visions of Mana has a host of great elements, and like I say, for the first 5 hours or so, it was well within my top 5 JRPGs of 2024. But as the hours passed, the game started to lose steam. There's no question to me that the first half of the game is better than the second half, and the two biggest proponents of that thought process came in the story and antagonist. The story initially, it kind of just happens. I think the biggest issue with the narrative here is that it tries to be more complex and deep when it didn't really need to be. The art style and overall feel of the game embraced that older fantasy style JRPG. The story should have done the same and kept it straightforward. There is nothing wrong with a basic story if it's told well. I've had great times with games like Unicorn Overlord and Dragon Quest XI, which never attempted to reinvent the wheel of their plots. Well, Act 3 admitted in Dragon Quest XI at least. Visions of Mana though goes down this existentialist route. It tries to give more muscle to its bones, but all it added was globs of fat. There are many developments in the game that I just rolled my eyes at, audibly saying to myself, well, that could have been easily avoided. And some of the plot points, especially between characters, are just abandoned. The later parts of the game also suffer from padding, a lot of backtracking for the sake of advancing an arbitrary thread of the plot, and it does have some pacing issues because of it. There were a few moments where I, no joke, almost dozed off. For example, Visions of Mana has a really annoying habit of showing a lengthy cutscene, allowing you to move for about 10 seconds, and then showing another long ass cutscene straight after. I'm fine with cutscenes being long, but don't give control back to me just to take it away immediately after. And you can't even go anywhere else in many cases till you advance the main plot, so you're stuck on the train tracks till the game tells you it's okay to do something else. And that sense of trying to be more complex is certainly true of the antagonist. Not the worst I've ever seen, but not good either. The motivation behind their actions in particular is just so silly to me. Even when everything is laid out bare to the player, all I could do was laugh. The mental gymnastics and leaps in logic made for this character are so off the wall it bordered on humorous. That's my biggest issue with Visions of Mana. It never needed to do this. The game was much better off keeping it straightforward as befitting the rest of its style. But here's the thing. I don't want to come down too hard here because I feel it is important to also consider what was happening behind the scenes too. Lest we forget, pretty much on release day, the development team at Oka Studios was shut down by NetEase Games, and it wasn't a case of complete Visions of Mana and you're now out of a job. No, dismantling of the team was happening during development, like a year to a year and a half before the game was even complete. By the time the game was released, it was done so with a skeleton crew before the studio shut its doors for good. And this is why I lament the wasted potential of Visions of Mana, this reality that we will never see its true form. There's no doubt in my mind that the opening half of Visions of Mana is what they intended. That was the vision of the game, if you will. If Oka Studios weren't effectively being dismantled by their corporate overlords and were given more time, I do believe we would have gotten something even better. I'm talking about a 9 out of 10 experience at least. The story would have been better realised and presented, there would be less backtracking, and we might have even got a bigger and more grand world to explore. It is a shame what happened to Oka Studios, and I hope that the team members have found work elsewhere. They didn't deserve what happened to them. Saying that though, they can live with a sense of pride they worked on something like Visions of Mana. Like I say, it is flawed, but my god, the highs of this game are obscured by the clouds. They're out of sight. It may not be perfect, but it's damn good. And finally, the 11th game I played was Final Fantasy XVI. Played on PC, and it took me 38 hours to finish. Man oh man, Final Fantasy XVI. Because of Square's insistence on Sony exclusivity for a period, I had to wait for this one, and the same is true for Rebirth. I'm very much behind the curve because of it, which is something I just accept. I don't suffer from FOMO to the extent that I'm willing to spend money on a console when I know the games I want will eventually come to PC anyway. And as a Trails fan, I'm no stranger to waiting. I'm of the mind that patience is rewarded eventually, and was hoping that would ring true for Final Fantasy XVI. 38 hours later, and it did. It did, man. I had a huge amount of fun with Final Fantasy XVI, and I dare say I would have had more fun if the PC port didn't present issues. While gameplay was fine and I had no hard crashes, the cutscenes ran horribly, and for a game that is centered on its story, that wasn't going to fly. A few mods sorted this out, including one that uncapped the 30 FPS cutscene barrier, but I also found that running the game at 120 FPS alleviated most of my issues. At 60 FPS it was still causing me problems. Once I got it fixed though, I was able to hunker down to what Final Fantasy XVI had to offer without intervention, and it starts really well. The game begins in the Grand Duchy of Rosaria, where we're introduced to the main protagonist Clive Rosfield, son of the ruling Duke. 13 years pass and Clive is now part of a group sent to kill another icon, Shiva, and it proceeds in a linear fashion from here. Now for the first 8 hours or so, I was having a really good time with Final Fantasy XVI. You control Clive and simply venture from main quest point to main quest point in self-explanatory zones. It's an action-centric style where you have standard attacks, perfect dodges, and the ability to call upon 3 icons at a time. It works well, the combat is slick for the most part and can be quite challenging in the later stages. I do concede though that I would have liked less of the damage sponge enemies that are common in these types of games, but there are combinations of icons that make staggering an enemy for more damage a doddle. It is fun though, at least for me. Yet, even as I enjoyed it, the bugbear in my mind was just strangling my brain cells, telling me that I wasn't playing Final Fantasy, or at least its gameplay didn't remind me of the franchise. It felt more like Square's take on The Witcher or Devil May Cry, which cool, those are great franchises in of themselves, but if I want to play The Witcher, then I'll play The Witcher. My biggest issue with Final Fantasy XVI in the early stages is that it lacked identity. It felt like it was imitating something else rather than drawing on its own legacy. When you play a Persona game, for instance, you know you're playing Persona because of its unique style and social sim aspects. When you play Atelier, you know you're playing Atelier because of the crafting focus and so on. Final Fantasy games, sure, they're generally all based in different settings with separate stories, but they all have common elements seamlessly woven within them that make you feel like you're playing Final Fantasy, no matter if that's Final Fantasy IX or 13. Final Fantasy XVI has those common elements, especially in regards to story, but I just wasn't getting that familiar flavour. Final Fantasy XVI, for instance, is a lot more gritty. I wouldn't say more mature, because I do think a lot of prior games have maturity in their stories too, but this one is more centred on the gore and shock factor. Many Final Fantasy games had an air of humour about them at times, but not so much this one. It's pretty much always keeping a serious tone outside of a few select moments, especially in regards to Uncle Byron. RPG elements feel basic in this game. Equipment management is just a simple case of visiting the vendor, buying a straight upgrade and going on your way. There's no mini-games. Enemy weaknesses aren't a thing. Status ailments and buffs for the player don't exist. There's not really any opportunity to over-level at any given point. The beautiful cities that they've crafted are mostly designed as set pieces rather than locations to explore, and the maps themselves, while they can be large and interconnected, don't have much in the way of secrets. You might find a mini-boss here and there along with some materials, but you'll rarely get anything meaningful outside of some accessories. Icons give the most customization potential, but they all boil down to another way to deal damage and nothing more than that. And then there's the fact that for the most part, you're only controlling Clive. You cannot switch control to any other member except for the awesome doggo Torgal, who has his own control scheme linked to Clive anyway. And sure, Lightning Returns does the same, but I remember that having more defined RPG mechanics in regards to stat progression and changing the role of Lightning herself with the Garbs. Final Fantasy XVI in terms of gameplay feels different, and that's not surprising. Square have been experimenting with the franchise for years. My problem with Final Fantasy XVI in those early stages though, is that it felt like it was copying other games from other franchises when it really doesn't need to. Even so, as the hours passed by, I came to care less and less about that seeming lack of identity. While Final Fantasy XVI doesn't offer what I personally look for in this franchise, I do see it as an excellent and satisfying action-centric experience. This game is very well made. The actual production values within it are staggering. Beautiful set pieces, smoothly animated character models, and a well-realised world all said and done with a host of factions and politics at play. The characters in particular, for the most part, really good. Clive, Cid, Gav, Mid, Torgal. The only one that disappointed me was Jill, who felt like a slice of white bread compared to the others, but even she had her moments. But what really stood out to me is that not only did Final Fantasy XVI have a host of likeable characters, it also had a decent amount of loathsome ones too, which is exactly what a story like this needs. The amount of times I just wanted to sock some of these bastards, well done to the writing team on bringing them to life. And the story overall, pretty good. I thought the early stages were better told than the later developments, but what it eventually evolves into is still presented decently. And funnily enough, it becomes more Final Fantasy-esque in storytelling the further it goes on, for what that's worth. One feature I did find myself appreciating though was the active time lore. If you press the select button during a cutscene, you can bring up a glossary of relevant terms and characters that will constantly update. So if a scene is going on and they're making references to stuff you may have forgotten, just bring up this menu and you're up to speed again. It ensured that I was always invested in the story because I always knew what was going on. Now, while the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI does drag at points, and it's hampered more by its lame side quests which amount to nothing more than errand boy objectives, it also has some crazy peaks too. In fact, I think the reason the game feels like it drags at times is because the low-key moments follow some of the best moments within the entire game. Like, let me back into that awesomeness. I don't want to be finding soil for this random dude back at home base. The build up to the big events is handled so damn well, and it generally ends with a bang because of the icon fights. The icon fights are, without question, the best part about Final Fantasy XVI. These are so damn good. Epic, impactful, visually striking. These are what boss fights are meant to be like. Look, mechanics and challenge, sure, they're a big part of what makes a great boss, but for me, I also look towards theatre and spectacle. Boss battles are an opportunity for a game to leave a lasting impression, and I'm so happy when they manage to do that. Final Fantasy XVI builds up its bosses into more than just enemies that you simply beat. They become obstacles that you need to stop, that you want to take down, and the story is integrated so well into the overall package of the resulting fights. I'm feeling the impact of not only the battle itself, but the story too. Seriously, I was in awe watching some of these. I felt I had seen one of my favourite boss fights ever devised, and then 5 hours later it was topped. They blew it out the park with these boss battles, every single time. Final Fantasy XVI is not afraid to go full on anime with these fights either. I'm certain there's a few Godzilla and DBZ references in there, and I'm all for it. It helps too that the voice acting is really good. I used English voiceovers this time around because of the lip syncing, and it was great pretty much all the way through, so well done to all the voice actors involved with this game.
It's me, Hannah, Rodney Murdoch's wife.
Lady Hannah.
Oh, I knew it was you. You haven't changed at all. The Lord Marquis and Jill too. It's so good to see you both again.
It's good to see you too, Lady Hannah.
And then finally, OST. Fantastic. If there was one thing that felt like Final Fantasy, it was the soundtrack. The compositions that Soken came up with, who was also the genius behind the tracks of Final Fantasy XIV, were brilliant. Every song matched the visuals on screen, they always added a more to a scene no matter what it was, and I can't fault it at all. So there are a lot of things that I hold in high regard from this game. Final Fantasy XVI overall though is an enigma for me. There's no doubt I liked it, but its gameplay leaves me conflicted. If I saw this gameplay without any idea where it came from, I'd think it was from a different franchise, but changing the approach of Final Fantasy is not new for Square. They've been doing it for years. I'd say my main issue with Final Fantasy XVI on the gameplay side though is, like I said before, its lack of RPG elements synonymous with Final Fantasy as a series, the lack of buffs and ailments controlling one character, its large yet seemingly bare world. It is unfamiliar in some ways, but then on the other side, it's just a damn good game which no doubt has callbacks to Final Fantasy, especially earlier entries. Like I say, the further I got into the game, the less I cared about its approach. Final Fantasy XVI may not be what I look for in Final Fantasy, at least on the gameplay side, but it's still a game worth the time of any action-focused fan. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.